So here's where stuff like I is really applicable. I mean, the first one, a, we already said. What's the square root of negative 1? The square root of negative 1 is I. And then b, the square root of negative 4. Well, remember the property of square roots. This is kind of how I works every time. You don't have to always write it out, but it is what's happening every time. Is that if we do the square root of negative 4, well, that's the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 4. And what's the square root of negative 1? That's I. What's the square root of 4? That's 2. So this is 2I. So that's the idea. You see, really, you're just taking the square root of 4, which is 2, and then the negative is just becoming an I. And so C is going to be the same idea. You're just going to take the square root of 8. So if you need to think about what the square root of 8 is, well, 8 is 4 times 2. So the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. So it's 2 root 2. So the answer, the square root of negative 8, is going to be the same thing, just with an I. So 2I times the square root of 2. And I suppose some people might even say it's better to write the I at the end. But I don't think that's so good because you might get sloppy and accidentally write that. And if you write it like that, that's not correct. You do not want the I inside of the square root. The I is outside of the square root. Because the whole point is that kind of gets rid of the square root. Is that when you have the square root of negative 1, the square root of negative 1 equals I. So the I, in this case, should not be inside of the square root. There's some cases where it might end up eventually, but definitely not in a case like this. The square root of the negative is just becoming an I on the outside of the square root.